being taken on Etherpad. It's linked from the agenda. And there's an audio feed as well, which is the main vehicle for remote participants. And Meet Echo, too. Yes, I do. Unless you're willing to, take over. No, I think we're good. You can help, because it's an Etherpad. You can help. Yeah? That'd be lovely. Okay, it's after 2, so we should probably start. So good afternoon. This is HTTPBIS. It's right after lunch, and I'm still jet lagged, so this should be interesting. We have an hour and a half today, and then we have 2 hours on Friday. So let's get right into it. So the blue sheets are going around. Excuse me. This is the Note Well slide. These are the terms under which you participate in the IETF, and hopefully everyone's familiar with this. If you're not, you can also search for IETF Note Well and find out more about this text. So the agenda we've got is today we're going to have a brief discussion of a related meeting. Actually, it's not related meetings, it's just related meeting. And then we're going to talk about the status of a couple specifications that we're finishing up, hopefully, and then go on to discussion of our active drafts. On Friday, the bulk of the time will be spent discussing RFC 6265-BIS, which is, of course, the cookie spec. And we'll also talk about some related and perhaps future work that we might be taking on and have some discussion of that. Any agenda bashing? No? Okay. So we have a JabberScribe. It's a new JabberScribe, so please be gentle. Charles, thank you very much. And Chris Newman is being our actual scribe. So thank you. Did you find the Etherpad? Great. So he's doing that in Etherpad. If people want to jump in and help him there or correct what has been said or whatever, that would be helpful too. It's at the top of the agenda. Sorry? Awesome. You're doing well as a JabberScribe so far. Excellent. So, is Jana here yet? Oh, that's a bit problematic. Sure. Please do. That would be most appropriate.
Not with this gentleman sitting next to me, I'm not going to. Many of you will have attended the quick bar BOF in Prague some time ago. This is a quick actual BOF. I'm Ted Hardy speaking. This is a working group performing BOF. The intent at this point is to take the formerly described monolith of quick and break it into appropriately sized building blocks and associate those with work here in the IETF. So some of the things that you may have seen in previous drafts of quick have been broken into individual drafts so that it's reusing IETF technologies better and more reusable by IETF technologies better. It is a UDP. Oh, look, I'm channeling this guy. Come and stand next to me, and they can see the person I'm talking to. We're at bullet point 2. Shall we try and read aloud together? Sure. A secure transport. I don't want to read it. Okay. A secure transport initially targeted at HTTPS. It will be Wednesday morning from 10 to 12:30.
In Potsdam 1.
In Potsdam. Now we're just echoing each other.
This is the most harmony I've ever seen in Google Standards participation.
So if you have questions about it, you can grab Jana, you can grab me, or a cast of thousands.
Yeah, and as I've said in the past, people who know about this, you know what you're coming in for. If you want to support us, please do show up. If you want to support this becoming a working group, please come in. If you do not want to support this becoming a working group, go to one of the other sessions.
Good. So I think most people in the group are aware of that work, hopefully. I think it's important for us because, as he said, one of the core targets is for HTTPS, and we want to make sure that that's a graceful transition. If a new protocol, a new mapping of HTTP semantics to a wire protocol, we need to, as a community here, keep an eye on that. So, moving on. Specification status. We have two specs that are nearing the end of our work on them, hopefully. One is the HTTP encryption content encoding. We had a working group last call on that ended just a little while ago. And we had some feedback on it in working group last call. I think, with my chair hat on, I'd like to see a little more discussion of it. It seems like there's not yet been broad discussion, but the people who have reviewed it seem fairly happy. We did get some feedback from Ecker more recently after the working group class call closed on list, and I think he wanted to open up some more discussion about that. From my standpoint, I'm happy to sit on this and let that discussion take place before we go to IETF last call. I'm happy for it to happen in IETF last call. So, Ecker, did you want to kind of expound upon the concerns that you had?
Sure. Let me see if I can do it by memory. So, when this was initially designed, it was designed to it was pitched as a simple mechanism that was without all the clutter. As background, the IETF has made a number of attempts over the years at designing secure messaging protocols of various kinds. And those protocols typically come with some form of key exchange, key establishment, and they come with a framing layer for the data, and they come with an integrity check. And so this was framed as being like, we're not going to take out all that baggage of S-MIME or Jose or whatever, and we're just going to put it all in one nice little package, only the thing we need. And over the as many standards do, over the lifetime of the standards development, it is bloated, and it's now picked up a number of features which I'm not sure are really needed, and conversely has this extremely odd attitude that the only symmetric algorithm supports is AES-GCM, while simultaneously supporting both out-of-band authentication and integrity and confidentiality keys, plus elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, plus finite field Diffie-Hellman. And that's an odd set of design choices. Thank you, but no.
Not going to happen.
That's an odd set of design choices. And so I think it'd be worth asking the question of what is the right set of design choices and what are the actual use cases, and should this be slimmed down or fattened up? And yeah. If we really need something this fat, maybe we actually don't need a new thing at all, but rather should just steal away the old things that was already nice and fat.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, having read your email and had very little time to think about it, there is a possibility here of maybe refactoring these sorts of things. The primary complex parts of this are only really used by the web push stuff. And it may be that we can sort of take those pieces out and sort of shove them over there and deal with that and keep this the relatively slimmed down thing that it was originally, which I think might go a long way to addressing that. On your points on the DH stuff, yeah, that removes all of that as well, because they have a very narrow profile. So web push has a very narrow profile as well, that we could then just use directly and sort of get rid of all the baggage that you have around Diffie-Hellman groups and all that sorts of other things. So let's talk about doing that. I can have a cut at that if necessary, but I need to think a little bit more about it, obviously.
I do want to say that to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing actually unsound about this document. I just am not sure that it's the right collection of features.
Right. From my standpoint, I'd like to see some more review, and I'm trying to decide whether it's best to get that in the working group or in IETF last call. It sounds like we might benefit from bringing it back to the working group for one more round.
I guess the only thing I'd say about this is it has now gotten to the point where it's not obvious to me that it's correct. Not that it's bad, but I'm just saying, like, there's enough pieces now involved that I'm not sure I'm not sure how to demonstrate that it's correct without some more work than I've done. And the original version I thought was relatively obviously correct, but maybe it wasn't, but it seemed obvious it was.
Okay, so let's have if this week and over the next couple of weeks, have time to iterate on that, work with Ecker, get a new draft out. We'll discuss it and probably go back to working group last call, do another WGLC. Is that going to cause issues for web push?
I don't know what other people think about that, but my view is that people are doing web push, and if I do this right, it won't actually change any of the bits on the wire for those guys. There's a large number of implementations of web push, and that's one thing that we've got to be a bit sensitive to.
And they are using this already?
And they are using this already.
Okay. All right, so I suppose working group, stay tuned, and when we get that next draft out, it would be great to get a few more eyeballs on it too. The other one is opportunistic security. And I believe with that draft, we're just waiting for a revised internet draft before taking it to IETF last call. I think we've addressed all the issues that came up in last call from memory. Mike Bishop is the shepherd for that doc. Is Mike in there? There he is. Is that where you see us being at as well? Okay, Mike says yes. So expect maybe even this week a new ID for that, which we'll then take to IETF-LC and then hopefully get that doc done. So let's move on again. The drafts that we currently have active are listed here. So let's start with RFC 5987-BIS, which Julian tells me we do have something to talk about. If I can get this to, let's see. Julian?
Hello? Does this work? Hello? Hello?
A little bit closer, maybe.
Hello?
But you're outside the pink box.
Okay. Next slide, please. So this is about a way to put non-ASCII characters into parameter values in HTTP header fields that was invented a very long time ago for mail header fields that I profiled for use in HTTP in 2010 because it was already implemented in some browsers, and after the work of writing down that standard, in the end the browsers that hadn't implemented it yet did so. So this is now widely deployed and interoperable. Next slide, please. There are a few changes I made compared to the proposed standard. Right? One of which was in the original spec, we required support for both UTF-8 and ISO 8859-1, because that's what existing implementations actually did. Turned out that Microsoft, when they implemented that, chose to support only UTF-8 for very good reasons, and actually one encoding that works is sufficient, so we are removing the ISO requirement from the spec. All the normative references to ancient RFC specs are gone, so it's now based on the recent 1.1 specs. And when I wrote that spec in 2010, I was under the impression that I had to extend the existing ABNF for parameters in HTTP. It's 6 years later now, and I realized that we actually never had a standard ABNF for parameters, so I have restructured the document, not trying to redefine something that doesn't really exist. So some of the stuff that used to be in ABNF now is in prose. Next slide. So I think I have done all the changes I wanted to do. Some of the changes I did last Friday, 8 days ago in the evening, so I probably introduced some breakage and I need to review what I submitted on that evening. And once I've done that, I think we are ready technically for working group last call. That being said, this spec also changed to an experiment in spring where we actually introduced non-ASCII characters into examples to test the submission path in the IETF data tracker, and we arranged that the IESG back then and the RFC editor were okay with that. So this now works for this draft, but it's not totally clear whether we can leave things as they are if we want to go to, if we want to submit that for publication. We'll need to find out this week, I guess. Otherwise, we'll have to back out these changes.
Thank you.
Next slide. Done. Okay.
Good. So any discussion of that draft? Any questions for Julian? Okay. I know that this is probably one of the lower level drafts that a lot of people might not take a deep look at. For me, we were having a discussion over lunch about this a bit, about, can we use UTF-8 in headers? And I'm starting to think that one thing that we might want to add to this draft is, and this is personally, is an explanation of why you would want to use this encoding and not use, for example, UTF-8 if you're defining a new header. Because there is so much software, and this comes up in a number of places in HTTP where on the wire, maybe from the client to the server, you can count on having a clean encoding, but once you jump through all the different hoops of the different pieces of software that's going to touch a header, you can't make assumptions about encoding, and you can't say, put it in UTF-8 and know that all the frameworks and the client-side APIs are going to handle that properly. And so there may actually be a place for this encoding even going forward.
So that would be more pros on the motivation.
I'm starting to think that way, so I might try and write up a pull request and see if people agree with that or not, or at least have the discussion. And this kind of touches on the discussion of JFV as well, but we'll get there.
Which might have that part about the motivation, so we might just move things over.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So our next draft, if I can find this again, is key. In Buenos Aires, we talked about parking this spec. I still see a decent amount of interest in the capability that's provided by this spec. What I don't see is as much interest in implementation. There have been people who have said they've started an implementation, but we haven't yet seen any interop or any full implementation in a cache. And I'm uncomfortable pushing this spec forward until we get some implementation experience, mostly because we kind of have one shot at it. If you want to change the format of how it works or change the vocabulary that you have for talking about request headers, you'd have to introduce a new key-like header, and that gets pretty unscalable pretty quickly. So if anybody wants to talk about key, we can do that now, but for now it's parked until we get more implementer experience or interest. And I guess the follow-on question, Alexi, are you comfortable with having a document parked like that for that purpose? We do have other things to do. Yes, it's true. Okay. Anything? Understood. Alexi says we're okay so far. Okay. Next up is the client hints draft, and Ilya is not here. Ilya Grigorik from Google is the editor on that one. This is work that, as I understand it, we're pretty much ready to go to working group last call on our side, but there's a corresponding integration of what to do, how to handle client hint generation in the browser that's happening in the fetch specification in the what working group. And so we're waiting for that to be completed and to be solidified before we actually ship this spec. So for now, it's on hold. If people want to start reviewing it, that's fine. I'm actually fine doing an extended working group last call on it if we want to, just to make sure that it does get an appropriate level of review. But I think that our work is pretty much done. Julian?
Julian Reschke. In relation to key and client hints, I think client hints currently sort of relies on key being there. So if we decide to let key sitting there, we'll have to change the client hint spec to at least change the reference to be informative.
Yeah, and I think you opened an issue about that, and we discussed it a little bit. My personal feeling is that it is effectively an informative reference. You don't need to use key to use client hints. It just makes it much more efficient. And saying that, I'm not actually going and looking at the issues lists for these, which maybe we should do just to make sure that we're not missing any discussions. So yeah, there were a few things open more recently. You opened an editorial issue, the quoted string handling for param directive. What was that? Yes. Back to key for a moment. Oh, right. That was just about the, we parked this until we got more experience with it. That's right. And that's a future feature. And these are all things that we felt we could sit on until we knew that we were actually going to move forward with the spec. Okay, good. And for client hints, yeah. So you opened the normative reference to key spec. I think that can be flipped into informative. Does that make sense to you?
Depends on the text that's referencing, right? I mean, might need some changes to the actual text as well, not only the reference.
So to channel Julian, he thinks it depends on the specific text, and also does require some other changes as well. Okay, so let's talk that through. And this issue here, I believe we said that is really just a placeholder for discussion in the what working group. Yeah, and with the HTML spec actually as well. Oh, sorry. Ah. That one. So that is issue 156. But the last I talked to Ilya, he thought we could probably go ahead and move this forward as long as we were happy with the state of what's in the what working group and in the HTML spec. Next, sorry? Jabber describing?
Yeah, you have a Jabber comment from Fielding. For hints, not sure that security considerations are adequate.
Okay, can he file an issue?
Client hints reveal a lot more tracking info than noted by the spec, because many sites don't allow embedded JavaScript in subframes.
So effectively, that's expanding the capabilities that those sites would have, or the information provided to them. That's an interesting discussion to have, yeah. Roy, could you please open an issue for that so we don't forget it? Let's see what kind of lag we have today. I'll assume he will. Thanks. The fourth spec is the origin frame. Oh, you know what? Let's make this easier. Where did the origin go? There it is. So right now we have two issues open on this. The first one is 178, opened by Martin. If an origin frame has a wildcard certificate, the origin frame allows it to narrow scope. But if we accept 177, which one was that? That was a pull request, wasn't it? Oh, that's the other issue, right? Supporting the delta, so allowing you to do a delta over time, not just do a single shot. There's a potential for the origin to lose any claim to wildcards without enumerating the entire space at a high cost and with a privacy risk. One way to avoid that would be to support the use of a wildcard, and the rules in RFC 2818 are probably appropriate. Yep. And we had a little side discussion about strange, evil things to do, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question. I didn't have time to Subodh. I didn't have time to file an issue, but is it specified anywhere like how origin frames interact with alt SVC? For example, like what is the origin specified when you do an alt SVC somewhere? And like it seems like we should use the original origin as still the rules for origin frames.
Could you open an issue for that? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ben Schwartz from Jigsaw. And, you know, I've spoken with some HTTP experts who say that you really should never trust content termination if you have multiple responses in a stream, that you shouldn't really trust the distinction between them. Essentially, you shouldn't concatenate responses from independent trust anchors. And so I'm wondering how that applies here. If I don't see anything in the security section indicating whether this is considered to be appropriate for use with a combination of origins that are not mutually trusting.
So the context here is that this is a facility to help with the HTTP2 connection pooling. The advice that you were talking about is in my experience, that's usually brought up for HTTP1. And this is not an HTTP1 mechanism. This is, HTTP2 already allows connection pooling where you can have multiple origins on a single connection under certain circumstances. And this is about more carefully allowing the server to specify which of the origins that a certificate covers to be used on that connection.
Right. Well, so I would appreciate a little more or clear guidance on whether this is appropriate to use with a combination of origins on a single connection where those origins don't have a trust relationship.
I think the guidance you're looking for probably is in HTTP2 itself, because the capabilities define in HTTP2. And I'm happy to show you, and we can talk through that. I don't doubt that more guidance would be good, but it's probably not for this spec, I think. Yeah. Is that on?
Take two? Okay.
That's better.
Mike Bishop, I think the other comment there is that with vanilla HTTP2 connection coalescing, all the origins you deal with are in the same cert. So there's likely more of a trust relationship there. Now, if we go down the route of supporting multiple certs, which we're going to talk about Friday, that's when things start to get interesting about, do those multiple origins and multiple certs have a trust relationship, or do they just happen to be on the same server?
Sure.
So, Martin Thompson, just staring at what's on the screen here, you were talking about flags, and it turns out that we actually have now a pattern that's evolving where we're using these flags to sort of build up an image of what a set of things is.
Yes.
And we have the positive and we have the negative and we have
this is at least two specs right
things
now.
And we have the we'd like to reset everything. I'd like to see us actually work on a coherent pattern.
How about an HTTP2 sets frame? Yeah, no, I agree. I think that some best practices at the very least would be a nice thing to have here, so we don't reinvent the wheel every time. Yeah. And since Mike brought up the, we will talk on Friday about the server certificates thing. From what I've seen so far, there's fairly strong interest in having a facility to add new certificates to a connection somehow. And the question that's in the back of my mind now is, should we maybe hold this specification back a little bit until we know more about that, because it seems like there's a level of coordination that might need to happen there. So if people have thoughts about that, I'd like to hear them.
So I actually filed issue 212 and forgot to tag it origin when I did it, so it didn't come up in your search.
Oh, okay. I can fix that for you. Consider it fixed. Oh, Martin, you beat me to it. So I think the outcome on this particular issue is what Martin was just saying, which is let's figure out some generic patterns for how to handle working with sets of metadata in HTTP2 frames, and then apply that here. Regarding your issue, where did it get to? 212. So that's along similar lines, isn't it? Which is, you're adding requirements to that. Good. So really, these three issues are all of the same kind of ilk in that sense. So what I just spoke about holding off on this spec a little bit, not stopping discussion, but not pushing forward a working group last call quite yet. Are people happy to wait around a little bit longer on it? I see nodding heads. I don't see any shaking heads. My co-author is nodding his head, which is good. Okay. Next up is perhaps a little more of a substantial discussion, especially given the recent activity on the mailing list, the JFV spec. So do you want to do an overview of that first, Julian?
So I used to have slides that I brought to many previous meetings explaining all the problems related to header field value syntax, and I am not repeating them now. So rather than that, I'd like to summarize what's been discussed on the mailing list lately. So not yet, apparently. I started that as a thought experiment 2 years ago because people were confused about how to define syntax for new header fields, and we've been wondering what if we had a standard grammar for that. And I played around with the idea how it would look like if JSON would be the format for that, although I really dislike JSON, but I tried that. So I've been working on that draft in my spare time over the last 2 years, and then in spring we adopted that as a working group draft with the underlying assumption that this is work in progress and we might end up with something completely else. Next slide. The draft shows that we could use JSON, but there are quite a few open issues and problems with that. So one of which being that it really creates a very chatty syntax on the wire. Another issue that we have that would be an issue for any other new format that we choose is that in HTTP we have the possibility that a header field repeats within a message, and we can't change that, at least not in HTTP 1.1 or 2. And the question is it the best way to define header fields in a way so that they can actually work with multiple values, or should we encourage people to reject messages where a field value repeats and concentrate on a syntax that does not allow list notation? Another open issue, is this something that we just define for, that we just provide for people defining new header fields? Or do we actually try to retrofit existing header field definitions to the syntax? And if we do, how do we deploy that? Looking at JSON, independently of the actual JSON syntax on the wire, there are JSON data model constraints that don't make us very happy, like the fact that although it allows members to repeat in the message format, the parsers don't actually tell you what happens. So we have a potential interop problem here. Mm. There's also some ambiguity or not, the way numbers are transported in JSON make the use of JSON numbers a potentially bad idea to use as a protocol element, because JSON would allow float notation and some kind of imprecision and so on. And then finally, is this just something that we want to use on the wire for HTTP 1.1 and 2, or is this something that would solve all the header field value problems in future HTTP specs? So is this something we want to do in the short term, midterm, or is that for the long term? Next. Yeah. Good.
So Martin Thompson, I think that was a good summary of the discussion that we've had. And I think to a large extent, the discussion that we've been having has sort of been hedging around the core problem, which is how much of this is a schema-aware language that we're defining, given that HTTP 1.1 header fields are essentially, I mean, you have to know what the header field means before you can parse it. So it's essentially schema-aware, but then each one of them has this informal, well, a lot of them have this informal schema-free component to the definition of them, where they have parameters or some other way of extending them. So how much of this is a schema-free thing versus a fully schema-defined syntax? And that sort of goes to the decision that you sort of went with JSON, is people actually understand where the boundaries are in JSON with respect to extending and how things define themselves, and where not to go, such as if this thing is defined as an integer, I can't just blob an object there and expect people to be happy, so I just don't do that. Even though it's possible in JSON, people don't do those sorts of things. So I'd like us to sort of maybe step back a little bit at this point. I know that PHK's talked about using CBOR in this context, and I think that sort of really, for me, cemented the problem, which is we don't actually understand what it is that we want out of this process. We don't understand where we need the sort of schema-free constructs versus the very tightly defined definitions. And obviously there's benefits on both ends of that scale. Obviously, if we can manage to pack dates into the most efficient representation imaginable, we had a big discussion about this during the development of HPAC. You can get down to 5 bytes for pretty much every single date that's ever on the wire, versus the 13, 14, 18, I can't remember exactly what the number is now. And there's some real efficiency gains there, not just in terms of saving bytes, but all sorts of other processing gains. So we need to walk that space, I think, a little more carefully. I'd like to encourage us not to commit to the fact that this says JSON in the title to JSON. I think the discussion has revealed to me that JSON is probably a bad idea for this. So we need to be a little bit more open, and perhaps this is something that where we use something that exists, or we go off and take the bull by the horns.
Invent.
Eric Nygren. Another area that's directly related to this, where I think this has the possibility to either make things better or much worse, depending upon some of these items, is the class of recent vulnerabilities around how different servers in a path produce different header fields, whether they're repeating, line wrapped. So some of these things around how do you deal with repeated values, if we're not really clear about that, or if we don't if we pick things in slightly the wrong direction, we could make things a lot worse there, or if we are much more clear about some of this. And I think this goes to Martin's comments on like trying to figure out what are we trying to solve, could actually make things much better if we could be much more clear about when things are and start being ambiguous. These are cases where you must start rejecting. And to avoid some of those issues.
So when we talked about adopting this, we were pretty clear that, as Julian said, that it might not look much like what it went into the process as. And from the recent discussion on the list, it's become pretty clear there's a lot more skepticism about using JSON than there was even a week ago. So I'd really like to see that discussion continue. I'm happy to keep this document adopted as a placeholder for an indicator of the interest in the working group in this topic. And again, when we adopt the document, the primary interest that I heard was, specifying new HTTP headers is really hard. And effectively, Julian is a bottleneck in doing so. If you want good review, you have to take it to Julian. We're now having other requirements being put upon what this work might be, and that might be a good thing. But I think Martin's absolutely right. Let's pick through them carefully and understand what we're doing and why we're doing and what the implications may be before we jump down a path too quickly.
Yeah, and the other thing to note here is that there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for fixing a lot of the problems that are apparent in the existing header fields. We need to develop a story for how this gets deployed.
Yes.
And that has its own challenges. Do we put in, do we have a date header and also a date star header?
Sure.
That has this new encoding, and what if they disagree and all those sorts of other things? How do you do backward compatibility?
And that is a separable problem to a degree. I can imagine approaches
yes.
to that even in HTTP2. We could work something out.
Yeah, so in HTTP2 we have settings and we
Exactly.
can negotiate it. But how do you incrementally deploy changes, or do you have to change them all in one tranche? And
well, one approach that I've thought about is you define a set of alternate headers for the standard headers with different names. You say this has the same semantics but a different serialization, and this is the precedence and error handling. And yeah, but then you have to negotiate its use. Yeah. So I think there needs to be a lot more discussion around that, and it seems like the discussion on the list is becoming healthy, which is good. Hopefully we'll see some more drafts where people can flesh out some of these ideas, but I expect we're going to be talking about this one for a little while, I think. Yeah, we're just starting.
So here's a question. Should we try to come to an agreement what actually the goals are? I mean, everybody has their own set of goals for this, at least from those involved in the discussion. And I think it's pretty clear that that we are probably not be able to address all these goals with one format, or at least not within like 24 months. So I think we should have a meta discussion about how is this supposed to help? What is the target? Because that will influence what we can do. I mean, discussing how header fields could be represented in HTTP3 is an important and interesting discussion, but I don't think that should delay any help for people doing things with HTTP 1.1 and 2.
Yeah.
So from the Jabber, how close are we to reinventing ASN1 or Turtle?
Who is that from? Was it Roy? Oh. Okay. I think capturing potential goals is a very useful thing to do right now. Maybe we just need to spool up a wiki page and start writing down and collecting some of the discussion there. Any other thoughts about JFV? Okay.
Was that a decision to spin out a wiki page?
I will start a wiki page, yes. Okay. We're not that formal around here. Last but not least for today, and I see we're doing very well with time, we have the cache digest specification, which we recently adopted. And the internet's very slow all of a sudden. There we go. And so we don't have any open issues on it, but there has been some discussion. I think Martin raised some issues around how complex the document has become since we had draft 00, which I think is fair feedback. As an author on that, so this is one of the documents where I'm an author, so we have a separate document shepherd. That's Natasha Rooney here in the front row. Wave, Natasha. There we go. Personally, you know, one of the reasons we did that was because it was hard to anticipate all the use cases for Cache Digest. And you can imagine a number of different patterns that both sites and browsers might want to use them in. And so we went a little bit shotgun on it to see if we could capture those. I am more than happy to have a discussion about what the high order use cases are and paring it back down if that's an appropriate thing to do. Does that make sense to you, Martin?
Just Martin Thompson, just trying to refresh state on that.
It's good like that.
So there is a piece of complexity that I suggested be added, and that was the URI normalization or something, at least some hand wavy stuff that.
So we actually didn't. I meant to respond to that and I didn't. So we don't really have URI normalization for the cache. So why would we have it for digests of the cache?
Exactly. Part of the problem here is I don't know what people do to the octets that get put on the wire. I'm a little worried that we're going to lose some
efficiency.
Yeah, and it is only an efficiency loss, but it's probably best to have some recommendations that people follow.
A conservative normalization, perhaps.
Very conservative,
Yeah.
and it's not going to be guaranteed to produce. It's not a canonicalization in the sense that you're going to produce exactly the same.
Lowercase the
sequence of
scheme,
octets.
lowercase the host, remove the port if it's the default port, that kind of stuff.
Basically, all the stuff that is actually in the HTTP 1.1 spec.
Sure.
With maybe a few extra things to sort of make it a bit easier. I did some of that exercise myself recently, and yeah, just nailed down the whole. I have this stale, I have this fresh, and how you manage those sets of information and the model that's associated with that, because I found that quite unclear in the document.
Yeah, I think we could do a much better job editorial, and that's my fault of explaining that, and maybe we need to go into the use cases.
And it seems like there's some sort of mismatch between the flags that you use to manage I think there's 4 different sets of information that you can potentially send out, and the reset and the complete thing, and it's all a little bit hazy.
Would you want to do a partial reset?
See, these are the sorts of things that you need to address. But
Yeah.
What happens when you put a reset on a frame that has content in it, and what happens when you put a reset on a frame that has a particular type of content in it?
Right.
You know, you've just marked something as being stale, and it's got E tags, and it's also got a reset on it.
Right. The intent is, and I agree, not clearly laid out, but the intent is when you receive a frame like that, you process the reset, so you clear your state, then you process the content. Because doing anything else doesn't make any sense.
Exactly, and that's the logical thing, but none of that's
Sure.
So I think this is like really good stuff. I think there's another piece of feedback that I need to provide around the probability stuff that I, 4 a.m. this morning was thinking about. But I think this is probably something I'd like to see go out as experimental rather than proposed standard, and relatively soon. Because I think once we sort through all of those minor issues, I don't actually see. There's just not that much to it. There's not that many moving parts here, and we don't get any value out of this until people start playing with it.
Right.
And I'd like to get to that point sooner rather than later.
What I'd like to understand is that at least initially, as a browser cache, owner, what kind of frames would you want to send out? Would you send out both fresh and stale? Would you want to send a complete set, or would you want to clamp it down to a certain size? There are a lot of open questions there, especially on the browser side, but also on the consumer side, of course, of what they find most valuable. But to me, that's more intuitive. I kind of know what I want to see,
Yeah, we're intuiting everything at the moment.
That's the problem.
And that's a real problem. That's why I want to see this as an experimental document that's published, in 6 months' time rather than in 3 years' time when we all agree that it's perfect, because we're not going to work this out until people actually try to start using it. I know that Stefan's done some implementation work on the server side, which is great.
But without a browser.
Some experiments, but I'd like to see this in the browser, and I'd like to see some real telemetry that
So-
comes out of that.
From a process standpoint, I mean, we could publish, what we called for H2 an implementation draft and say, we're using this to gather feedback and burn one of the experimental frame IDs rather than giving it a real frame ID. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think I'd be happier just pushing it through the process.
Just experimental and burn a frame ID?
Yeah, it's just not that complex.
How many do we have? I forget.
There's not many frame IDs.
Yeah, that's why I was like,
I think it's 16.
How many bits is it?
In the private use range or something. It's an 8-bit.
it's an 8, okay.
We have to be careful with these things.
That's why I'm a little bit, yeah.
Oh, we may not be able to do experimental now that I think about it.
Because they're only 16.
No, because, oh, well.
I mean, process-wise.
Process-wise.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, because the registry policy. So, So one of the patterns that I started with a different draft, but I didn't carry on into this, was I burned an experimental frame ID, but I put magic at the beginning of the frame payload to disambiguate it from other experimental uses. And that's something we could do. Because that'd give us something, 3-4 bits, whatever.
No, experimental will be fine.
Did you look at the registry policy?
Sorry.
Or IESG approval, Mike Bishop.
Anybody else have a preference on which path to take there? I mean, if we only have 256 of these things, it's still potentially burning one. Of course, we still have status codes left over, so, Okay. I'll have a side discussion with you, and we'll work on some of the use cases. Is anyone intending to implement this on the client side or on a cache side?
Kazuho. Actually, I have a service worker-based implementation using headers.
Yeah.
So that could be done by others as well, and it can be used immediately.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And yeah, if folks don't know, Kazuo is the other author on this draft. Okay. I know that on the list and in some back channel, I also got interest in people using this for non-browser to server cache digest communication, so cache to cache. For folks who remember, Squid has cache digest and has had it for probably 2 decades or so, where it uses for inter-cache communication. I'm not sure we should explicitly target that use case, but we shouldn't explicitly disable it either, I guess. Yeah. Oh, yeah? Right. Were any client side? Do you remember? Okay. All server side? Okay. I think, there's a lot of server side interest in this because of the potential benefits. So. Okay. Anything else about cache digest? Kazuho, did you want to say anything more? No? Good for now? Okay. All right. Well, we have a half an hour left, but I think it's probably a natural stopping point now. On Friday, we have 2 hours, and we have a fairly substantial discussion of the cookie spec, and then a few different proposals that have been in flight for a little while. And I think we do have enough time of it for all of that. Charles, you wanted to talk about SDCH? You're not ready to do that now? Okay. Patrick, cache control immutable, are you prepared to say a few things about that yet, or you don't want to wait till Friday? I don't need slides. I know that you can win a crowd. If you want to wait till Friday, that's fine. I'm just wondering if we can use this time now. Okay, that's fine. And Gabriel, I'm guessing you're not ready for the Internet of Things discussion quite yet, are you? Friday? Okay. We're a working group who likes to get our slides in early. That's a good thing. Yeah. Okay, well, let's break early then and give everybody some time back. Sorry? Ah, yes, I got conflicting messages about whether that was something we would actually talk about. Are we going to talk about that here? I got conflicting messages about whether people want to. I would have done it at the beginning, but someone told me not to. So, okay, please do.
Okay, so we're tomorrow morning, 8:30 in the morning, in the morning, in the room over there, Charlottenburg 1. We're gonna have a meeting talking about blind cache, the different uses and of secure content allegations. So you're all welcome who's interested in this topic. Please prepare. At least take some look at the drafts being announced on the mailing list, etc. And it's available. So.
Okay. So we've talked about blind caching on and off. Charlottenburg 1, I think? Yeah. We've talked about this a few times, so this is an informal event to continue that discussion. You'll go? You're gonna give it a go? All right. I can put on like the iTunes visualizer behind you if you want or something. Yeah. Okay.
So if you check out my slides, I'm going to talk about a new cache control extension that we will, we are currently deploying a version of this for Firefox after this being brought forward by our friends at Facebook. And it's a cache control extension called Immutable. And it has basically the property of you can ask me if this resource has changed an infinite number of times for an infinite length into the future, and the answer will be 304. And that's the semantic of the extension. So typically you would combine this with a really, really large max age, which is what you see people doing today. So this goes to a design pattern you typically see on the web, where resources, particularly sub-resources, images, JavaScript, that kind of thing, never change. When they do change, they just get renamed and the references to them use the new names, right? So Facebook made a public post on this topic and they said some phenomenal amount of their traffic, and this is because I have not read my own blog post to prepare for my slides, which don't exist, maybe 20% of their traffic was essentially 304s for resources that had not been around, that had not been alive as long as the max age they were published with, right? So they publish a max age of a year, and people, 4 minutes after this resource came into existence are saying, hey, have you changed yet? And at first we were all like looking around at our cache code, like, why are we not trusting our cache code? 20%, yeah, it's a huge number. And a huge number of round trips from, the latency sensitive client point of view, and a huge amount of load on the server to look this up and to generate a 304. So if you look at somebody's wall page on a lot of social media sites, and you're like, I don't know, maybe you're looking at relationship status, and it says, single, reload, single, reload, single, reload, in a relationship, yes, right? 1,000 HTTP transactions happened on those 5 reloads, when what you were really interested in getting was the update on the markup. So that's like what's behind this. So just for fun, we sort of ran a mock-up with Facebook, and it performed extraordinarily well, taking what you would expect, the 200 resources on that page, click and reload, turning it into 3 or 4 transactions, right? Really nice stuff. I published this on my blog. I started getting a bunch of tweets, 5 or 6 like other very small little websites started publishing this because it was a really easy little attribute just to do. And that seems to be working out well. So this is currently, I believe, in the Firefox beta channel. The reason I wasn't going to bring it forward as an internet draft at this meeting was we haven't put it out onto release yet and run the official experiment to see what the numbers look like, but that is the intention. And maybe in Seoul or something, we'll bring a draft forward to make that happen. The most interesting thing people want to usually talk about is its interaction with MaxAge, and so we should clearly talk about that. The way I have it defined, the semantics are, currently we'll always return 304, so don't bother asking. So I do honor MaxAge in case you're doing hit counters or something like that, but what happens at the end of MaxAge is a non-conditional request is done for the object. So if you'll never give me a 304, I don't ever send if modified since. And that was the semantics of you putting a mutable on it. We can talk about that, but that's a regular topic of interest, and that's about the only one that comes up in how does this work.
But explicitly you modify the semantics of reload so that it doesn't emit a request. That's the big change.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you right here. I could not hear you, which is really weird.
Really weird. The change, the biggest change in semantics is that for when this is present, the reload semantics change. So you don't issue a request on a reload.
That's correct. I
Okay.
use it as you get an automatic cache it without a validation.
Okay.
Brian Call, Yahoo. We also see about 20% of 304s on the servers. Why aren't browsers actually taking the max age into account more often and not actually going and asking for the resource again?
You mean without the presence of immutable?
Yes.
So we interpret max age as essentially a lease period for which you can reuse the response, but it does not make a guarantee about the content of the entity on the origin server. So we interpret someone as pressing reload as looking for an update of the data on that page. Huh. Is the stock quote different?
Yeah, I kind of figured that was the case, but yeah, it's 20% of our traffic.
Right. Well, immutable allows you to disambiguate that.
And it's I've talked to other large companies, and they're also seeing around 20% of their traffic is also 304s.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is the other thing that's been brought up. Is like, well, if the max age is big enough, why don't you just imply immutable? And that makes me kind of nervous.
Sure.
Because your content is immutable. I'm worried about all that other content.
Julian Reschke, while have you up there and we're talking about reload, could you say one or two sentences about the difference what browsers do upon F5 and control F5? Is there still a difference?
Oh yeah. So control F5 has always meant, or shift F5, it depends. There's a hard reload semantic depending on where you are and what browser you're in. But the normal reload sends off a bunch of 304s on a page, and the shift reload ignores the cache and loads everything from scratch. And that's still, even in the presence of immutable, is what happens.
Okay.
Roy Fielding.
You are not Roy Fielding.
Thank you. Immutable should just override older things like max age, since that allows non-deploying clients to interpret max age as normal. This is the design of cache control. Yeah. And while he's at it, Mark, please add more information in tools.ietf to point contributors to the GitHub page for issues and put some instructions on how to assign issues to specific drafts.
Okay. It's very hard to put information in tools.ietf without involving the tools team. So
the other thing I was going to touch on, as long as I'm standing here.
While we're still on that one, have you done anything, does it affect your cache eviction algorithm at all?
What?
Immutable.
Does it what?
Affect your cache eviction algorithm.
Cache eviction algorithm? No.
Okay.
But it's an interesting question now that you mention it.
Okay.
But it does not.
Okay.
Which means if you deployed it without max age, you would get a heuristic number, and I don't think that's an awesome idea.
You don't want to deploy without max age, but yeah.
Yeah. So I was going to mention, because we sort of concocted it in the same experiment, we have deployed, and more recently Chrome has deployed, Brotli as a content encoding option for the web, widely done. It's been really successful in terms of efficiency, so you should look into it especially from the client side. The client side, it's very similar in time and space to gzip, very, very similar. It's harder on the server side, so if you're pre-computing, it's kind of a no-win, and if you're not pre-computing, or a no-brainer rather, not a no-win. If you're not pre-computing, it's a harder decision. What I wanted to bring up here, though, was purely from an interop point of view. We've done it over HTTPS only, and that has largely been successful in terms of just learning what look at that. In terms of learning what we're able to deploy. There was one problem with one piece of antivirus software, which its failure mode, it passed through accept encoding of Brotli just fine, and when it got something back content encoded and it did not understand it, it decided that was actually okay, and it gave the client the direct byte streams of the message body, but it stripped the content encoding header. Yeah, and that didn't go so hot. So, but that was bug fixed and out there, and that was the only big problem. So it's looking like, at least in HTTPS context, more of these encodings negotiated in the usual way, no sniffing or anything like that, is looking more plausible. So I feel good.
I use it on my website.
Yeah, no, it's only an HTTPS. The rest, yeah. Is there another web? Antivirus, yes.
So following Subodh Iyengar, so I was following up on this. With immutable, would it also make sense to deploy only with HTTPS? Because you add an additional risk where like some man in the middle adds an immutable property and forever caches in the browser.
So we only do it over HTTPS.
Martin Thompson, the other thing that you also do is you only do it for strongly framed stuff, which is if the connection closes and to mark the end of the request, that's not good enough.
Right.
HTTP2 or something with a content length that actually matches up with the length of the bytes that you get. There's a bunch of icky stuff around what you've got to do.
We were talking about this in the mailing list the other day of how much this happens out there in the space, that you get responses that have framing that doesn't make any sense. And you're right, we don't trust immutable under those circumstances.
Yes.
Good. Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. You did. It's awesome. Okay. So we don't have quite as much extra time left anymore. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to bring up? We can do any other business today, and then Friday's left for the rest of the agenda. The issues list for OPSEC. I may have, yes. Apologize, I'm working under heavier jet lag than usual. Where did it go? There it is. I think this one's done, Mike, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe so.
I think we just forgot to close it. Let's check.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. Why isn't this closed? Oh.
Yeah, we had a whole bunch of back and forth, but
We did come to a state where we were happy with it? Yeah, okay. So we can close this? Mike is happy to close this. Cool. Okay, that's all we've got for today. See everyone on Friday, and don't forget the quick buff. Oh, did you have something? Sorry.
Chicago Cable Labs. I wasn't going to bring this up on the working group, but since there is time, I thought I'll just ask. So this was a email that we sent out a while ago about the range request and the bytes issue.
Yes.
And there was quite some interesting discussion that happened, and I was trying to just kind of get a gist of what the final suggestion or recommendation was. I think that would be helpful.
Sure. So that is. Where did we put that? So there was a discussion of, as I understand it, you need a slight tweak to the semantics of the bytes range unit. And the question was, can we modify the semantics in place for bytes, or is a new range unit required? And this draft was proposing the latter approach, which is a new range unit. And there was a discussion, as I recall, I think Roy was advocating reusing or changing the semantics of bytes if we got data, and I don't mean to put words in his mouth, I'm sure he'll correct me, if we get appropriate data that's reasonably safe with implementations, and I don't think we have that data yet. Because there's a risk to introducing a new range unit as well. Not only in terms of, it will break or it won't give you the benefit of caching, for example, with intermediaries that don't understand this new range unit, but also we do have some data that there are some extremely bad implementations out there that assume that if range is present, it's always bytes. And so there's risk on both sides. And I think for me personally, the end of that the state we left that conversation in was we need more data to decide which path is less risky.
So, all right. So at least based on our own just testing for the applications and the libraries we were using, trying to change the semantics of byte itself was very risky because we actually encountered libraries that just kind of flipped up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we are proposing that I think the safer option is to actually go with the defining a new unit, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to understand if there's any objection to define the new unit. So granted that with the new unit, there might be some caches or some proxies that may, just because they're expecting just bytes, right? They may just do something weird. At the very least, the worst case scenario should be that they should not cache it because they don't understand it.
Exactly.
If they do anything more than that, then they are really, really bad implementations.
Right.
So should we actually like try to even care about those really, or should we actually try to find out if they're really that bad? So I think what we're, I guess, proposing is there any objection to kind of moving forward with or proposing a new byte, a new unit, and we can come up with a name and everything else. But I was kind of left a little confused about what the recommendation was in terms of a new unit.
Right. I think, well, does anyone in the room have any opinions or thoughts about that?
No, but Roy has a comment that it's not really changing semantics, it's just breaking stuff.
Okay. It's certainly possible. I mean, we would look at, in terms of adopting a new draft, we'd look at everything, that we'd look at for the rest that we adopt, which is there implementer interest in it? Does it address a broad set of use cases for HTTP? We generally try not to adopt things that are just for a specific application, but rather that are general facilities for the protocol. And I think that certainly this probably is okay by that latter metric. I'm less certain right now whether there's implementer interest. And of course, if we start a new range unit, there are potentially other things that might be interesting to do at the same time, other modifications that people might want to make to the semantics. Julian.
2 points. If there are really many intermediaries or actually important pieces of code that do the wrong thing with an unknown range unit, I'd like to know. So I'm totally in favor of having that experiment, which leads me to the question, in your use case, would you use that over HTTP or over HTTPS?
Both.
So I forget who did it, but someone went and did the research on this, and the bugs that they found were in things like client libraries for media, for streaming video. And so this isn't necessarily an intermediary problem. We can certainly go and look at Squid and Traffic Server and a few other open source implementations at least. But these were in, open source and closed source media libraries consuming streaming video, which is, as I understand it, your core use case. So
if we haven't talked about that today, but we still plan in the midterm to actually open up the core specs and revise them for full standard. So the question is whether the change that Roy has thrown in, whether that would be actually that we could do when we move to full standard. And another thing that comes to mind is the shaky relationship between byte ranges and other content encodings, and whether we would like to do something about that as well, if we start working on that. Like to clarify, you really can't do a byte range request in practice over something that has been dynamically GZIP content encoded.
Yes.
You can, but you won't get what most people expect. I mean, people who understand the specs said that's clear. It's clear that you get that, but it's not the intuitive answer.
Yeah, and that's come up from time to time. There's not yet been enough interest to pursue that.
So just a final question. So we were proposing, is it possible to have a bytes or an additional range unit as a individual draft or a submission, or does it need to be a working group item?
That depends upon the registry policy, and I imagine that it's going to be IETF review. That was the policy we chose for most things, but we can find out in just a moment. IETF review, yeah. So because this working group exists, I think my intuition is there would be a substantial amount of pressure to do it here.
Okay.
And that's completely reasonable. I think we just need to have the discussion with implementers and make sure that it gets appropriate review and that there's no objections.
I'm perfectly okay with it. I just wanted to make sure that if people are not interested, we really need the unit, and I'm okay. We are okay to go through the motion.
You're talking to the right people for now. Yeah. So what we can do is let's start a discussion on the mailing list and get people to spend a little time reviewing it and see if we can come to some idea about whether we want to adopt it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Anybody have anything else?
Since we seem to have time, even though it seems to be shrinking, there was a topic that Sabine raised on the list back in March about once we start having early data in TLS 1.3, what's the interaction and binding into HTTP?
Yeah.
And we haven't really talked about that much recently that I saw, but it seems like something we're going to potentially need to raise, because if TLS is saying, hey, there's a special API here, there's, I think, going to need to be some clarification of when it's okay for HTTP clients to use that API.
Yes. So go ahead.
Martin Thompson, this is actually really easy thing to answer. So we had a bunch of discussion about this one, and Patrick made some interesting discoveries about how people replay requests in the real world. And it turns out that you have to replay posts.
Yes.
The internet depends on, the web depends on it. And if you don't, everything breaks. And there's some really funky examples that Patrick can go into that were just mind-bogglingly terrible. But the net effect of that is you end up in a situation where if you send a post request and you get 0 bytes of a response to that, you'll automatically replay that. You've got no evidence that the server has actually received that message and processed it, so you have to replay it. There's a lot of situations where you send the post request and the server kills the connection and expects you to retry again. And that is exactly the situation that we're in with zero RTT. We're in a situation where we're sending a message and we don't know if the server's got it at the point that it arrives. It could be replayed, and we're in a situation where we won't get any response back in those situations because, well, it's being replayed by some attacker and it's gone off into the ether. But again, the same net effect. If it's not idempotent, then it's not idempotent, and you've just paid someone $100 twice rather than once. All of those sorts of things are real, but the fact of the matter is the web has this vulnerability already if we didn't realize it. It's been there for a long time and we kind of depend on it. So the API that we ultimately settled on was you open the socket, you write to it. No other signals. There's only one signal that you need, which is the server told you that your zero RTT data was not accepted. Please replay it. And then you go off and obediently replay them, all of that stuff again. So that's where we're at. I know it's going to make some security people open their veins, but I mean, that's just one of the trials of being a security person. You have to deal with that.
And that, as I'm sure you remember, I started researching this at the same time and found that intermediaries are doing much the same. You know, some intermediaries respect the HTTP specs somewhat, but nobody does it perfectly.
Yeah, so Pat McManus, so to flesh out that story, in Firefox 46 through a change I didn't fully understand the implications of, I disabled replay of post on a broken persistent connection most of the time. And I can say without equivocation that the web does not work if you do that. Dozens of blocking bugs, people wanting to release hotfix releases. It was not a good day. But I learned all kinds of curious ways in which the web does require replay of post and everything else, some of which might amuse some of you. There is a website out there that has a persistent connection timeout on the server side of 250 milliseconds, which has got to be about the worst possible number one could choose, which results in a collision of trying to use that socket almost every single time. And yet the bug report says works fine in IE and Chrome, right? Always, right? And did in Firefox until I updated this morning. Have another website that, depending on which URI you request from the site, actually executes that under different permissions on the server side. And it doesn't know how to make that change on an existing persistent connection. So it just says, oh my God, I need to be somebody else, and closes the connection, assuming you will call it back. What's really, really fun about that is when that happens, you of course just, instead of making a new connection, you're like, well, I've got this other idle persistent connection, I'll use that one. And so you go like right through your pool. And so unless you are willing to replay at least 7 times, you cannot successfully connect with the server. So I think it's Adam Langley that said, you know, if TLS doesn't repeat it, or if TCP doesn't repeat it, TLS will repeat it. If TLS doesn't repeat it, HTTP will repeat it. And if HTTP doesn't repeat it, the damn user is going to hit reload and replay it themselves. So it's going to get replayed.
Subodh Langar. So to add to this point, I think there's one part of the component that's still missing, like, which is the, so basically it comes down to like the application is the only one who knows whether or not this data is idempotent. And we can provide from TLS, we can provide like various like defense in depth techniques to sort of like limit the replayability of the initial data. So we need a mechanism for the application to tell the lowest layers, like so at the socket layer, it'll just be a write. But there at the like if it's a mobile app or if it's a browser, there'll be something on top of it, which like basically schedules the requests, which can be written out onto the socket and does it, which is aware of like the application level idempotency guarantees. So one of the proposals, hopefully we'll discuss as HTTP workshop or something like that, but one of the is adding a header field, which is like, this is retry safe. So for example, like even if you have a get request to the body, then like the application has no idea.
It's possible, just not defined.
Yeah, but so like the application can tell you through the header, like, hey, I'm actually like safe, and you can retry me, and we have use cases for this also not only on the client side but also on the load balancer, for instance. So if you have like a smaller data center or something like that, and you have like a bigger data center, so it actually like. There was a Google paper about this like a while ago where you could actually kind of improve your latency by because one of the data centers will have like not enough capacity. So if you retry this other data center, you've saved the timeout that you didn't get the response back from the initial data center. So if you retry it, and you can only do this if like the load balancer knows it's safe to retry. So what's that? Well. Well, like put is also like that depends on your application semantics as well.
Yeah.
So it's not really like our application semantics not fit into like put, and also like really put is also in a multi-distributed data center environment. Like you can't really guarantee like the idempotency of put as well. So so I mean it's like from HTTP specs situation it says it's idempotent and it's cool. But there's some debate about that as well. But so yeah, like application API and header is like a reasonable way to do it. I'd like to open it up to like what people think.
Okay.
And given the kind of given the somewhat surprising nature of post, not actually, or of the idempotent nature, not therefore of post, is that something that's worth the working group actually putting a document together to make this very clear that this problem's been punted up to the application layers and that they should not assume the post is the way it is and that they should handle appropriately?
Well, you go ahead, Martin.
So Martin Thompson, I was going to sort of point out that some of the things that Subodh was talking about are still relevant for people who are using HTTP outside of the web. And there's a lot of people who use HTTP for other things. And if you're not on the web, or you have a much better behaved set of people that you're dealing with, I think the rules that we have in HTTP 1.1 should still be respected. And in general, when people are using TLS, they need to be aware of this replay property. The things that we're doing in browsers will be horrific from some perspectives, but we do all sorts of nasty things because we have to deal with the swamp that is the web. I think that there's probably value in having a document that says, you know, RFC 7230 says these things, or 7231 says these things about the idempotency of these methods. You should respect that. However, realize that when you deploy things like post on the web, it had better damn well be idempotent, or you're going to get some surprises. And I think that's useful guidance that we could give the community.
Right. Yeah, and this is becoming more relevant because we have TCP fast start, we have TLS 1.3, we have Quick coming down the pipe potentially, and all of these have impacts.
So the only one of these that really matters, I think, is TLS 1.3. But well, and all the clear text stuff out there that's replay happy as you like, but you know.
Well, Quick will have the same problem, but hopefully that'll be factored onto TLS 1.3. Yeah. It will be. Yeah. Okay.
Subodh Iyengar, like last 4 minutes, hopefully, take the rest of your time. So another question I have in this, for example, the idempotency properties and stuff we specify, would it be is the working group okay with specifying that this is only applicable for secure transports and you cannot use it for insecure transports and stuff? So that would be, so you couldn't use idempotent data on TCP fast open, so that you'd need a secure transport to do TCP fast open plus TLS 1.3 or TLS 1.2, and then you would get all these properties. And for similarly push and all these other new features are coming around.
There are a surprising number of protocol facilities where that decision has been made. So I certainly think it's something we could talk about. But yeah, I think we have to talk about the existing text in the HTTP RFCs to make sure that it's still correct. And as you were saying, talking about potentially new protocol facilities to help applications get the desired properties more easily. And also to communicate that information down to the lower layers. So there's potentially a lot of work to happen here, but I think we still have to do a lot of discussion. I think we'll hopefully see some new drafts about it soon. So I can't believe this, but I'm going to have to close the lines because we're almost out of time. We just seem to burn a half an hour there without even trying. And anybody have anything else? No? All right. So the quick BOF again is on Wednesday, and we will meet again on Friday. Thanks a lot.